Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. This time, we're going to be taking a deep dive into fast fashion. We're
Ooh.
going to be going way beyond those flashy ads you see and really looking at what's going on. From the impact fast fashion has on the environment to the often hidden human costs, we're going to be covering it all. And we're even going to be tackling that tricky concept of greenwashing and how to spot it. So to get us started, we're going to be looking closely at a 2023 report.
Okay.
It's called Unraveling the Harms of the Fast Fashion Industry. Buckle up, everybody, because this is one deep dive that might just change how you think about the clothes you wear.
I think that's a great way to put it. I mean, seriously, we're going to be uncovering some facts and figures about this industry that might make you think twice, before you head out on your next shopping spree.
Definitely. I mean, one of the things that just completely blew my mind when I was reading this report was that the fashion industry's carbon emissions
Yeah.
are actually higher than international aviation and shipping combined.
Right. Crazy, right?
Yeah, it's just wild when you think about how big those industries are.
Exactly. And it just really goes to show the massive impact that fast fashion has on the planet. And the thing is, it's growing fast. We've seen garment production almost double in just the past 20 years.
Wow.
And global consumption, well, that's increased by a whopping 400%.
So it's like everyone's suddenly buying 4 times as many clothes as they used to. What's driving that kind of demand?
Well, a lot of it has to do with this constant cycle of new trends. The fact that clothes are just so cheap nowadays, it really pushes us to buy more, wear it for a short time, and then toss it. And it's really scary to think that about 60% of clothes end up in landfills within just a few years. A few years.
That's insane. And I know, a lot of people are talking about this company, Shane. Apparently, they upload something like 1,000 new styles every single day.
Every single day, yeah. That's right. And some estimates I've seen suggest that could mean they're making like 50,000 new pieces of clothing each day. Yeah, it's a lot. I mean, it really makes you wonder, where all those clothes are going to end up and what impact that's having on the environment.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think it's time we dig into those environmental impacts because it seems like there are a lot of costs associated with every stage of the process, right? I mean,
Yeah.
from getting the raw materials to what happens to clothes once we're done with them.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, there are huge environmental costs at every single stage of that process, starting with the land that's needed to grow those raw materials. Then you've got the factories where the clothes are made. And of course, you can't forget the journey those clothes take to actually get to us. And then what happens when we throw them away?
Yeah, it's like this whole long chain of impacts. And we hear a lot about different materials like cotton and polyester. So what's the story behind some of those fabrics, like environmentally speaking?
Okay, so let's take polyester as an example. Most people don't realize that it's actually derived from oil. And the crazy thing is, the fashion industry uses millions of barrels of oil each year just for polyester. Yeah. And obviously that contributes to a ton of problems like habitat destruction and even more greenhouse gases getting released into the atmosphere.
I mean, it's amazing to think that something that ends up as a soft T-shirt starts its life as crude oil.
Exactly.
Okay, so what about natural fibers like wool? Are they a better option for the environment?
So wool itself is a natural material, but there's a bit more to the story than that. Raising sheep for wool actually contributes to deforestation because
Yeah.
they need to clear land for the sheep to graze. And it takes a lot of water, too. Plus, you have the issue of water pollution from animal waste and the chemicals used to process the wool.
Oh, wow, I didn't realize that. So even natural materials can have their own set of issues.
Right.
I guess that makes sense. Okay, what about cotton then? I mean, it seems like the most classic natural kind of fabric.
Right.
So what's the impact of cotton?
Well, cotton is a really great fiber, super versatile, but it needs a lot of water, like a lot. For example, to produce enough cotton for just one pair of jeans, it takes roughly 10,000 liters of water.
That's crazy. So for our listeners, imagine wearing 10 years worth of your drinking water.
Yeah.
That's how much it takes to make just one pair of jeans.
That's a great way to put it into perspective.
And I know there are also concerns about the pesticides used in cotton farming.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Conventional cotton farming uses a ton of pesticides, which of course can harm ecosystems and pollinator populations like bees and butterflies.
Right, yeah.
That's why a lot of people are starting to look at organic cotton as a better alternative because it's grown without those harmful chemicals.
That makes sense. So we've talked about how the materials themselves impact the environment, but it's also about how those materials get turned into clothes, right?
Exactly. It's the whole process.
Yeah.
And water is a huge issue there. The fashion industry uses a truly insane amount of water, like 79 trillion liters each year.
Yeah.
which is about 20% of global wastewater.
That is just an incredible amount of water. I had no idea. And I know that wastewater from the textile industry is a big problem. What makes it so harmful?
Well, one of the biggest issues is the dyeing process. It releases a bunch of toxic chemicals into our waterways. And these chemicals can harm aquatic life, obviously, but they can also contaminate crops that are being grown in nearby areas.
Wow.
Yeah, and the volume of wastewater from textile dyeing alone is mind-boggling. It's something like 93 billion cubic meters. That's enough to fill almost 37 million Olympic-sized swimming pools.
I mean, that's just disturbing. We're talking about a massive amount of toxic waste. And then there's the whole issue of microplastics, those tiny plastic fibers that come from synthetic fabrics like polyester.
Right. Yeah, microplastics are definitely a growing concern. And the thing is, every time you do a load of laundry, you're potentially releasing tons of tiny plastic particles into the water.
So it's like every time we wash our clothes, we're contributing to this problem.
Yeah.
Where do those microfibers end up?
Well, a lot of them end up in the ocean. Some estimates say that around 500,000 tons of microfibers enter the ocean every single year. And obviously that can harm marine life. And there's even concern that it could end up in the food chain. I don't think we fully understand the long-term consequences of having so much microplastic in the environment.
Yeah, it's a scary thought. So we've talked about the environmental impact of producing those raw materials and then actually manufacturing the clothes. But what about the people who make these clothes? What are their working conditions like? We'll delve into that in part 2 of this deep dive. But first, I'd love to hear from you. What stood out to you from all this, from all these statistics?
What really gets me is the sheer scale of the problem. I think we often think of our own individual clothing choices as, not really making that much of a difference. But when you multiply that by millions and millions of consumers, it creates a huge impact, both on the environment and socially.
Yeah, for sure. It's easy to forget that. We'll be back in just a minute to continue our deep dive into the world of fast fashion.
It's so easy to get caught up in the excitement of finding a good deal, on a trendy outfit. But it's important to remember, those low prices often come with a hidden cost.
Yeah, it's almost like there's a disconnect between the clothes that we wear and the people who actually make them. Like out of sight, out of mind, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's often the case, unfortunately. Those incredibly low prices that we see in fast fashion stores are often only possible because of the exploitation of garment workers in low-income countries.
Right. And I think most people, they kind of have a vague awareness that there are some ethical problems involved in fast fashion production. But I think it's hard to grasp what those issues actually mean for the workers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you maybe paint a picture for us of what it's actually like for a garment worker?
Well, a lot of garment workers. And it's important to note that a large majority of them are women, face really difficult conditions. They work long hours, often in factories that might not even be safe, and they're earning wages that are barely enough to live on. And in some cases, they might even face, verbal or physical abuse.
It's just heartbreaking to think about. I mean, these workers are creating the clothes that so many of us wear every day.
Right. It's a huge contrast. We tend to think of fashion as glamorous and exciting, but for many of the people who make our clothes, it's a real struggle just to survive.
I remember when the Rana Plaza disaster happened in Bangladesh back in 2013. It was such a tragic reminder of how dangerous those conditions can be. Over 1,000 workers lost their lives when that garment factory building collapsed.
Right. It was a terrible tragedy, and it really exposed the serious issues within the fast fashion supply chain. But it did lead to some positive changes, like the Accord on Fire and Building Safety, which was a legally binding agreement between brands and trade unions to improve factory safety in Bangladesh.
So at least there have been some efforts to address those safety concerns. But what about the issues of, low wages or exposure to hazardous materials? Are those still big problems?
Unfortunately, yes. I mean, while there has been progress on safety, issues like low wages and health risks related to chemical exposure are still really common in the garment industry.
And you mentioned earlier that most garment workers are women. Does that create additional challenges or risks for them?
Absolutely. Women working in garment factories often face additional issues, like discrimination, gender-based violence, and even a lack of access to childcare, which can make it almost impossible for them to escape these difficult situations.
It just seems so ironic. Fast fashion is marketed as affordable, accessible, but it's the most vulnerable populations who end up bearing the brunt of the costs.
Exactly. Both the social and environmental costs often fall hardest on the people who can least afford it, workers who make the clothes, and the communities living near those factories that pollute their environment. they often have the fewest resources to deal with those impacts.
It's a vicious cycle. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about something that's been on my mind. Greenwashing. It seems like every brand out there is talking about their sustainability efforts. But how can we tell what's genuine and what's just marketing?
Yeah, greenwashing is a huge problem in the fashion industry. It's become really common for brands to use misleading marketing to make themselves seem way more eco-conscious than they actually are.
So what are some of the tricks to look out for? How do we spot greenwashing?
Okay, well, one really common tactic is creating what they call conscious collections, which maybe use a small percentage of recycled materials, organic cotton. But the vast majority of their production remains exactly the same. It's really just a way to make themselves look good without actually changing anything.
So it's all about appearances, not actual action.
Right.
What else?
Another thing they do is emphasize a single sustainable practice, like using recycled packaging, but they ignore the overall impact of their production process. So it's like focusing on one tiny detail and ignoring the big picture.
I remember all the controversy around H&M's environmental scorecards. I thought those were supposed to help consumers make more informed choices. But it turned out a lot of their clothes were labeled as more sustainable than they actually were.
Right. Yeah, that's a classic example of greenwashing. They were misleading their customers with false information.
And even things that sound positive, like recycling, maybe aren't as straightforward as they seem. Is recycling really a solution for the fashion industry?
It can be part of the solution, but it's not a perfect fix. Recycling synthetic fabrics like polyester doesn't solve the microplastic problem, and it can actually make it harder to recycle other materials, like plastic bottles. And ultimately, even if a garment is recycled, it doesn't stop a new one from being made to replace it.
So we're back to this issue of overproduction and consumption. I mean, with all these challenges, it's easy to feel kind of overwhelmed. Is there any reason to be optimistic? Are there any brands out there doing things differently?
Yes, definitely. There are brands out there who are taking real steps towards sustainability. They're rethinking their entire approach, from the materials they use to the way they design and produce their clothes. It's about moving beyond just empty promises and taking concrete action.
I like that. So what are some of the things that these brands are doing differently? Give me some examples. I need that optimism boost.
Okay, well, some companies are starting to challenge, that whole idea of always needing to buy new clothes, like Levi's. They've been encouraging people to wash their jeans less, which can really help them last longer. And they've even started repair programs so you can fix your favorite pair instead of throwing them out.
I love that. It's such a good reminder that we don't need to keep replacing our clothes all the time. What other brands are doing cool things?
Patagonia is another great example. They've got this program called Worn Wear, where you can trade in your old Patagonia stuff and get credits to buy new or used items. It's all about promoting a circular economy.
What does that mean exactly? Like a circular economy in fashion?
So a circular economy, it's a system where resources are kept in use for as long as possible. Instead of that take, make, dispose model that we're all used to, it tries to eliminate waste by reusing, repairing, and recycling.
So with Patagonia, they're basically keeping their clothes in circulation longer, giving them a second life, instead of them just ending up in a landfill. Are there other brands doing that kind of thing?
Yeah, definitely. There's this company called MUD Jeans, and they have a really cool leasing program. Basically, you pay a monthly fee to lease a pair of jeans for a year, and then you can decide if you want to keep them or return them to be recycled.
That's so interesting. It really changes how we think about owning things. What about new materials? Are there more sustainable options besides organic cotton?
Oh, yeah, for sure. There's a lot of really cool research happening right now looking at sustainable materials. We talked about organic cotton. But there are also other natural fibers like flax and hemp. They need less water and pesticides than conventional cotton.
It's great that those materials are making a comeback. What about totally new fabrics?
Oh, there's some really exciting stuff in that area, too. Have you ever heard of banana tex?
Banana tech?
Yeah, it's made from banana plants.
No way. Banana plants. That's incredible.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And one of the great things about these plant-based fabrics is that they're often biodegradable, so they won't end up as waste in a landfill.
So we've got brands changing their designs
Yeah.
and how they produce clothes, and we've got all these cool new materials. But what needs to happen at a bigger level to really make fashion more sustainable?
Well, I think real change requires everyone to step up. Governments, companies, and individuals. We need governments to create policies that hold companies accountable for their impact on the environment and on people. Companies need to commit to ethical practices and be transparent. And we as consumers need to make informed choices.
So it's kind of top-down and bottom-up approach. What kind of policies could help?
There are some really promising things happening right now. Like in the US, there's the Fabric Act. It focuses on protecting garment workers and encouraging companies to manufacture clothes in the US. There's also the Fashion Sustainability and Social Accountability Act, which is all about transparency. It would require companies to share more information about their supply chains and environmental practices. And then there's the Sweat Bill, which aims to make sure garment workers are paid fairly.
Those sound like some really positive steps. But what about individuals? What can we actually do? It's hard to feel like our choices matter when you're talking about an industry as big as fashion.
I think your choices absolutely matter. Every time you buy something, you're supporting a certain way of doing things, so you can choose to buy less. Buy secondhand, repair your clothes, upcycle them, and support brands that are truly committed to sustainability. You're sending a message to the industry that way.
It's a good reminder that we're not just passive consumers. We actually have the power to change things.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of talking to people. Talk to your friends and family about this stuff. Share what you've learned. And support organizations that are fighting for a better fashion industry.
Yeah, using our voices is so important. It's all about being conscious consumers, not just in what we buy, but also in how we engage with the industry.
I like that.
So, big question. If your clothes could tell a story, what story would you want them to tell?
That's a great question. I think I'd want my clothes to tell a story of, conscious choices, respect for the people who made them, and for the planet. A story about quality over quantity, durability, timelessness. I want my clothes to reflect my values.
I love that. That's what we should all be striving for, a fashion industry that values people and the planet. This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. I know I'm going to look at my clothes differently now.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here and for giving us hope for a better fashion future.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has inspired you to think more carefully about your clothes and to use your voice to advocate for change. Remember, every purchase is a vote, so choose wisely and wear your values with pride